Hello everyone, my name is Spencer Taylor and I am an environmental health specialist in the Arkansas Department of Health, and I'll be giving a presentation today over benzene exposure in Scott County. So before we start, I want to give a brief overview in the presentation. So we're going to cover three main topic areas: a little bit of the background of benzene, what is it, where is it, and how you can be exposed to it. We're going to go over the health effects of benzene in adults, children, and an occupational setting. They all have slightly different nuances associated with them. And then we'll end with ways to prevent and reduce benzene exposure so that you know how to protect yourself from benzene. So as I just stated, we're going to go over a little bit of the background of benzene. And so benzene is an aromatic compound. What do I mean by that? So let's go ahead and look at the structures of benzene on the slide. I'm going to start on the far left. You see these lines. Each of these lines are made to represent different carbons, and the double lines indicate double bonds between the carbons, and they help form an aromatic structure as seen in benzene. And so this middle one, the hexagon surrounded by a circle, is just another representation of benzene, along with the one on the right. All of these are benzene, and it's made of 6 carbons and 6 hydrogens. It's also colorless, which means it's kind of hard to identify. Some people report it as a light yellow liquid, but it's probably better to think of it as colorless, and that you're not really going to notice benzene. It could look just like water. It's flammable as well. Major routes of exposure are cigarettes and gasoline. Although it's used in the process of manufacturing for many other things, cigarettes and gasoline are probably going to be the two biggest exposures that you need to be concerned with. And so when we're thinking about gasoline, we also need to think about the evaporation of gasoline fibers. If it's really high in your workplace, I'll get to that in a second when we go over the major routes of exposure, and as well as dermal exposure if you spill gasoline on you. So the major routes of exposure are probably going to be from the cars. If you're a mechanic and you're constantly working with cars and you're around gasoline, if you work at a gasoline station, or even if you're in a densely populated area with lots of cars, the possibility that you are exposed to benzene is a little increased. So what happens when benzene enters your body? Well, just like anything else, your body's going to try and break it down. And so let's say you ingest some benzene in the form of gasoline. Not sure why you do that, but just play along. Well, your liver is going to break it down to some metabolites. And 3 of the main metabolites I'd like to discuss are catechol, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, hydroquinone, and phenol. Catechol is naturally found in fruits and vegetables. It's also found in cigarettes, and it's incredibly carcinogenic. Some studies have shown that it increases stomach cell growth in mice, among other things. Hydroquinone is also found in rubber, and it's also carcinogenic. It has been shown to cause nephropathy, which is issues with the kidney, and increased kidney growth in rats, as well as some effects on the thyroid in mice. Phenol is also known as phenylformaldehyde. I think we're all familiar and have heard of formaldehyde before, but it's also used to make salicylic acid sometimes. But phenol is also carcinogenic. It has been shown to cause skin cancer in mice and leukemia in rats. So where's the 3 common things of all these metabolites is they're all carcinogenic, and that's going to come up later when we discuss in depth the health effects of benzene. So now that we know a little bit about benzene, let's learn a little bit about Scott County. It's going to be hard to discuss the possible health effects of benzene in Scott County without discussing Scott County. So the residents of Scott County number a little over 10,000. About 1,200 or so lack insurance coverage. This is a decrease from previous years, and this is a really good thing. More people seeing their doctor is always better. More people having access to their doctors are always better. Commute to work is about 20 minutes, and so this is probably a good thing as well. It means that you're not a heavy, densely populated area, as evidenced by this statistic of about 12.6 people per square mile, and so that's going to reduce your exposure to benzene because you're not going to be sitting in traffic all the time. You're not going to be breathing in all these gaseous vapors from gasoline, and there's going to be less benzene in your environment. But unfortunately, about 20% of the county smokes, and this is not good because, as we just discussed, benzene is found in cigarettes. Smoking in general is not good for you, but as it relates to benzene, it's also really not good for you. So these are going to be your 2 major routes of exposure, through cars and through smoking cigarettes. The cars are probably a little lower on the list in Scott County, but the smoking is still very important and should be addressed. So now I'd like to discuss the history of the health effects of benzene. We've actually known about this chemical for a while, since the 1800s. In 1897, a scientist named Stentesson demonstrated that there was chronic toxicity from benzene in 9 different cases. He followed 9 cases, and he saw that benzene was not exactly good for them. In 1928, a couple of scientists associated it with leukemia, and then in the 1960s, there was a large amount of research on benzene and the different health effects. But what I'd really like to discuss here is something called the pliofilm study, and this was published in 1977. So what is the pliofilm study? The pliofilm study followed these rubber workers from 1940 to 1949, so over the course of 9 years, and it showed that they were very exposed to benzene in this process, and they had an increased risk of leukemia. So you're probably thinking, okay, how much is the increased risk of leukemia? Is it really significant? Is it not significant? 1, 2%? Try a 5-fold excessive risk of leukemia in these workers and a 10-fold risk of excess death from myeloid and monocytic leukemia. And it was named the pliofilm study because that was what the chemical is called in what I believe is the Goodyear chemical plant. I think they had a patent on it. And it's found in plastic. I include a little picture over here on the right. I, for one, was uncertain and had never heard of pliofilm until I had read this paper from Smith discussing the pliofilm study. So now we're going to discuss the health effects of benzene on adults. And to do this, we need a little bit of background to blood cell development. I am sure this is a very overwhelming slide, but don't worry, I'll walk you through. Just follow the arrows. So what happens is when we make blood cells, they all come from one cell, this multipotential hematopoietic stem cell. Stem cells are found throughout your body, and they just help regenerate the cells and tissues in your body. This process is really complex, and it requires different signaling molecules. These signaling molecules can be things called growth factors, which stimulate growth, interleukins, and cytokines. And all these signal to cells to go down the myeloid lineage, which is shown on the left, or the lymphoid lineage on the right. And so, as you can imagine, this is incredibly complex. And if you got to make all these different cells, you got to have lots of growth factors. And there's a lot of ways you can mess this up along the way. And so that can lead to certain leukemias like myeloid leukemia or lymphoid leukemia, which just refers to what type of cells are affected. If it's a myeloid leukemia, then cells of the myeloid lineage are going to be affected. And so what does benzene have to do in this? Well, it damages what is called the hematopoietic microenvironment from this paper by Snyder, Witz, and Goldstein. And so it's going to mess up all these growth factors and interleukins and cytokines that are needed to make our cells normally. It's going to cause overgrowth or undergrowth or no growth, and it's going to cause a lot of problems in this whole process right here. And as you can tell, it's incredibly complex. And if it's incredibly complex, that means we really need this to be synchronized so that we're all making the right cells at the right time. Okay, so we're done with the tough part. I know that was probably a wild ride to get through, and I am personally not a fan of big complicated charts like that. This is a little bit more simpler, but I did want to continue upon this topic of the health effects in adults. And it's very important to know that these effects might not be seen for some time. And what do I mean by that? Well, remember in 1897, it was established that chronic benzene toxicity, that means it takes a while. It's going to occur over time. You're not going to get exposed to benzene once unless it's a super large dose where you're going to have these very adverse health effects. The pliofilm study covered 9 years of data and 9 years of exposure to very high amounts of benzene for them to have problems. And that's really important because when we're exposed to benzene or other insults, your body can probably cope with small amounts of them. Think about it. If you've broken a bone, that bone's not going to stay broken forever. If you get sick, depending on the sick, say you get a sore throat, you're not going to be sick forever. Your body's going to be able to respond for that. Those hematopoietic stem cells are going to regenerate some cells and you'll be all right. But over time, it's going to cause multiple injuries to these cells. And that's when you can develop major problems. And one of these problems is acute myelogenous leukemia. And I think this quote's super important. It's from this paper by Snyder, Witz, and Goldstein. And it says, there's unequivocal evidence that benzene is a cause of acute myelogenous leukemia. That is huge. That means benzene causes AML. There's no other way to say that. And if you're exposed to benzene a lot, there's a very high chance you'll get AML. It's also associated with multiple myeloma, possibly, which is another blood cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, another blood cancer, and acute lymphoblastic leukemia, another blood cancer, because it's really hitting this blood-borne environment. We're not exactly sure why, but benzene just loves to go to the bone marrow. Even though it's metabolized by the liver, as we stated earlier, benzene just loves to go to the bone marrow and just mess with the cells right there. So this is really important. So a lot of the signs that you're going to see in health effects may be very subtle. It's not something that you might feel, like when you get hit with a hammer, you're not going to feel pain necessarily. It's very hard to tease out how to notice these effects. and they're very subtle. You have to go to lab tests, and you got to be able to see your doctor to notice these changes over time. This photo in the bottom right, I think, is really good because it shows what leukemia is. And leukemia is a cancer of blood cells. And just like any cancer, cancer means overgrowth. So on the left, we have normal blood. You got plenty of erythrocytes, also known as red blood cells. That's what we normally see. Some platelets and some of these other immune cells. On the right, with leukemia, you see this massive overgrowth of these cells, and that is what leukemia is. You have too many of the wrong cell type, but it's referring to cells in the blood, not necessarily a solid tumor like breast cancer. So I'd like to discuss the occupational health effects of benzene, and because that's really important. Some of us may have different exposures to benzene. That's important to consider. Someone who's working in a hospital or an office setting probably isn't exposed to gasoline nearly as much as this man in the picture unloading the gasoline truck from ExxonMobil. So Salem and a few others did this study in gasoline workers in Egypt, and it found that obviously they were exposed to higher levels of benzene, and these higher levels of benzene meant that these workers had higher levels of DNA damage by a few of the measurements they did. Gaffney and a few others studied oil refineries, specifically an oil refinery from ExxonMobil in Baytown, Texas, that's near Houston, Galveston. Over 30 years, from 1978 to 2006. I can't do math very well, but that's a lot of years. And they found that there was less than 1 part per million air exposure of benzene, and that's really good. That's below the EPA limits that's needed. And the exposure decreased over time. So they looked at 2 main time points. They broke 1978 to 2006 into 2 chunks, the first half and the second half. In the second half, there was a lot less benzene, and the exposure also depended on your job. And that is a point I want to make because, like I said earlier, different people are exposed to different amounts of benzene, and different people in the oil refinery are exposed to different amounts of benzene. So when we talk about prevention, it's going to come into play because you need to know your environment. So I mentioned in the previous slide 1 part per million. I want to give a graphic representation of what 1 part per million is. So in this big cube right here, see that little red spot, that one that you can barely see? You're probably trying to fix your glasses right now, get real close to the screen. That would be benzene. All those other cubes would not be benzene. That means 1 part of a million is benzene. And then on the upper right, we have 10 over 1,000 would be benzene, and 1% in the upper left. So as you can tell, that's a very small amount of benzene. So the health effects of benzene on children. This was a little tricky because this paper by DeAndrea and Reddy mentioned that there's not much information on the health effects of benzene in children. So what they had to do was they had to do a meta-analysis of sorts. They had to gather and review papers that had been published because there just wasn't a lot of data on it. So one of the studies dealt with Texas City. They had a BP accident in their oil refinery, and it found that children near that refinery had lower white blood cells. Those would be like the monocytes and things like that, and they had higher levels of platelets. These children also had increased liver function enzymes, and so that means that's basically an indicator of liver damage. And in Argentina, there was a study on the lung effects of benzene. And so they looked at 3 groups of children who were near a chemical plant, children who were exposed to very heavy amounts of traffic, and children who were in relatively non-polluted areas. And they found that kids who were near the plant had increased rates of asthma and increased rates of lung issues as well. So it affects children as well. And what you need to know about that is you just need to know your exposure. You need to know what's around you and how to prevent that. So now I'd like to discuss prevention of benzene exposure. And so in the BP safety manual, a lot of their precautions dealt with intense brief exposures to benzene. So that means if benzene was over 1 part per million, then you need a mask or inhalation protection. So obviously neither you or I has a device that just lights up when the benzene level is too high and tells us to put on a mask. But if you know your environment, and if you're unloading the ExxonMobil gasoline truck, maybe you should wear a mask and help decrease your inhalation exposure, and so that would protect your lungs a little bit. If you spill gasoline on you, you should leave the area so you don't get more on you. Remove any clothing that has the gasoline on it, and then wash your skin with some soap and water, as this gentleman is doing in the right. What you also need to do is inform your doctor of any occupational exposure if you're in high-risk occupations, and your employer should be able to help you with this if you're exposed to large amounts of benzene, such as oil refineries and things like that. And a lot of this is about knowing your environment and limiting your exposure to benzene. The EPA and a lot of these companies like ExxonMobil in the study have decreased the exposure rates of benzene in their own workers. So thankfully, this is not something that a lot of us are exposed to on a daily basis in large amounts. But you just have to know when you're in high-risk situations and how to protect yourself from those high-risk situations. Wearing gloves, maybe when you're filling up your lawnmower and you can spill some gasoline on you. And checking in with your doctor regularly to check your blood tests and make sure you're okay. And talking to your employer and your neighbors to make sure that everything is where it needs to be to protect yourself and your family. So I'd like to end with another quote because I think this is very pertinent. And it states, a key to reducing damage from all carcinogens, whether identified in animals or in humans or in both mammalian species, centers on reducing exposures. We need to know our environment and not be passive and make sure that we know what chemicals are going into our bodies, what chemicals we are exposed to, and how to measure these exposures and how to make sure that if we are exposed to them, we are not harmed and to minimize the damage from the exposure. So here are a few of my references, and here are a few more of my references. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something from it, and I really hope you didn't fall asleep during it. And please contact me with any questions you may have.